Good morning. How is everybody this morning? Good. Any announcements we need to make? I don't know, Vinny. All right. Well, good. Good. Ecclesiastes 7 is where we are. Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Headed straight through the book of Ecclesiastes. That didn't make it feel any better, did it, brother? Mm, sure it didn't. Bless your heart. Mm. The book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon is searching for happiness and understanding. I think it's a life journey. I really do. I do think that Solomon writes this book by inspiration, but he writes it at the end of life. Written from a standpoint of trying to give information to his children, to those that are going to follow. He condemns wisdom. Let me ask you maybe two or three different questions and see what we just come up with kind of collectively. When I say the word wealth, what do you think of? Money. Okay. What else? Risk. Yeah. Very much. What else? Excuse me. Supposedly happiness. Yeah. Yeah, because I got everything I need, supposedly. Accumulation of goods, accumulation of things, usually of money. And now, do remember that in biblical times, wealth was not what you had in the Bank of Jerusalem. Why? No Bank of Jerusalem. It was what you possessed. It was what you possessed. Namely, such things as clothes was one of the big things that marked your prosperity. So you basically, in many ways, the average Joe went through life day to day. But seeing that wealth is sort of the accumulation of goods, things of value, things that we have, let's ask a second question. What's wisdom? Experience. How you use your knowledge? Yeah. What else? Relationship with God? Yeah. What else? Anybody else? Wisdom is all of these. It's, from a clinical or strict definition, it's the ability to take what you know and to put it to use or put it to action. That's if you went to Webster, that would be kind of the definition you get, which is kind of what we got from you all. Solomon, if you recall in Ecclesiastes 1, about verse 18, condemns wisdom. But now he kind of gets back to a point of where wisdom ain't all that bad in the 7th chapter. He's going to show really the advantages, especially as you get from middle to the end of this book. Or chapter, excuse me. He's going to talk about, what good wisdom is. And so he begins kind of, and really the 7th chapter in many ways is just some practical wisdom itself. Here's some things that I learned. Here's some things that I found out. And so as he begins the first verse of the 7th chapter, he says, a good name's better than precious ointment in the day of death than the day of one's birth. We talked about that last week, so I'm not going to spend much time in it, just to remind you that here's a good beginning point. And the beginning point is to have a good name. Have a good name. Have a good reputation. Be an individual of character. Don't be a character. Be an individual of character. But be an individual that has been well, or is well thought of. And as he looks at all of this, then beginning in verse 2, excuse me, he's going to talk about here's some positive marks with regards to wisdom. And he says, verse 2, this is where we start now this morning. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. That just seems so antithetical or opposing or in opposition to the things that we really believe, right? Better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting, to go to the funeral than anywhere else. Now, I've known some folks that's what they do. I knew some folks that enjoyed going to funerals because there was food there. I know of a lady, she has since passed. She really did enjoy going to the visitation part of funerals. Now, she did stay for funerals or go to funerals, but she really went for the visitation part. And the reason was that's when she could see everybody. So she would go, she would say, she'd go up front, she'd say her condolences, her sympathy, to extend it to the family. And then she would go back and she would sit down and she would be very nice, she and her husband. And she was a victim of, she was a victim of polio. And she was, by the time I knew her, she was, well, not all the time, but for the most time, she was in a wheelchair. And very sweet lady, knew a lot of people. The reason why she stayed funeral home life. But she'd go and she'd sit for the visitation. Well, we don't think about that. Really, if we have to go to the funeral home, we're going to run in and run out. And that's fine. I mean, as long as you get said what you need to the family and just leave, that's fine. We don't like to be around death. Now I want you to hold that thought, and you're going to have to hold it for 2 or 3 weeks, but we get into the latter part of this book. That's important. But notice what he says. He says, it's better to go, I'd rather go to a funeral, he says, but we'd rather go to a party, right? Than to go to the house of feasting. For that is the end of all men. He says, it's all over with. Sort of cynicism here. He says, it's better to go to a funeral. Why? Because that's the end of it for him. And I don't have to worry about it anymore. He's finished. Sorrow, he says, is better than laughter. For by a sad countenance the heart is made better. Sorrow makes the heart pleasing. Pleases the heart. Not really. Sorrow does put life in perspective, though, doesn't it? Balances. I'll tell this one on my sweet wife. I don't think she would mind. Last night she was in the back part of the house, and I went back there to make sure she was all right. Check up on her, and she said, I'm better off than a lot of people. Okay, well, that hadn't come out in the last 2 weeks. Wonder what brought that down. And she read a letter, or read something on Facebook, excuse me. She read something on Facebook from somebody that she did not know who is in bad shape. Bad shape. And we also, yesterday, we heard a girl that we grew up with. We know that it was not, this was her second or third marriage. We don't know, and that doesn't matter, but it is to say we didn't know him. And he was considerably older than the girl. But anyway, he found out last week he had cancer. He passed away yesterday. So that is to say that there are folks that are worse off than we are. And so sorrow in some ways makes us understand where we are. Good times, what is the tendency in good times to think about with regards to ourselves? Just let the good times keep rolling, but we don't stop, right? We don't analyze. Why? Well, it's just keep it rolling, keep it going. But then when we're stopped in our tracks, we do tend to realize where we are, what's going on, how blessed we are, even in bad situations, even through tough times. We need to look for and usually can find the blessings. I was reading something this week that I thought was interesting. This individual talking about prayer. The subject of what I was reading was talking about prayer. And this individual made the statement. He said, so life's not going great for you right now, and prayers don't seem to be answered. He said, okay, go back and look at the times your prayers were answered. Now, he was talking about being patient, waiting on God, and God will work it out. But he says, think about the times that your prayers were answered. Count your blessings that way. And I just thought it was a great little point. It was something I had been thinking about in the last few weeks, but we have to understand that balance in life is important. So he talks about sorrow is better than laughter. Well, not really. Of course not. And we don't, like I said, we don't like it, but it does give us perspective. He says the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of the fool is in the house of mirth. Check yourself, check your thoughts, check your purpose, check your aim, check your direction. Anything else along those 4 verses? Excuse me. What? Yeah, 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 yeah. Hope so. Hope so. Hope somebody said something good about me. Good point. Anything else? Well, he talks about rebuke, verses 5 and 6. He says it's better to listen, or well, New King James says hear. It's better to hear. It's the idea of listening. It's better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the songs of fools. What do you learn from praise, and what do you learn from rebuke? Do you learn more from rebuke than you do appreciate praise, right? Appreciate, and put effort into lessons, and folks walk out and say, that's a good lesson. Appreciate that, or appreciate what you did. I do not like criticism. I do not like rebuke, but I learn from it. And I appreciate it to that end. I appreciate the learning aspect of it, or the aspect of, okay, well, maybe I need to see it a different way. Maybe I need to look at it a different way. And notice what he says here. It's better to hear. It's better to listen to the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the songs of fools, people that don't know what they're talking about. It's for like the crackling, the sound of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. You've sat around a fire, I'm sure, and you've watched the fire, and you've heard the pops, and of course, that's the water in the wood that is, as it gets heated, that little bubble that's there, it pops, the popping of the wood. And but in biblical times, there wasn't just a whole lot of trees around, and so they gathered up anything that would burn, and they gathered up these thorns, and that would be really the main aspect of their fire. They'd gather up these thorns, what we would just say, the weeds, throw them in the fire. Notice what he says. He says, for the crackling, the sound of the thorns under the pot, they crackle a lot. He says, so's the laughter of the fool. The individual that hasn't thought through what he says, the individual that hasn't seen and understood and learned and knows where he's coming from. He says, this is vanity. And then he says, with regards to 7, 8, 9, he talks about sticking with it, the long haul, sticking with something. Long haul is better than the shortcut. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. The end of things better than the beginning. The patient in spirit's better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe, he says, it debases the heart. Bribery seems to be quick and satisfying, but it doesn't bring on all that it should. as he talks about the oppression, as he says, oppression destroys a wise man's reason. Oppression, difficult times. You don't think about what's going on. You're all of a sudden you're in a panic. Why? Because you're going through difficult times and you're trying to figure out reasons and answers and solutions, and you don't give it thought. It's kind of interesting, at least the way I look at this verse, and you may look at it different, and that's fine. We can discuss it. But the way I look at this verse is he says, he says you get in a panic and you don't stop, don't think it through. And he says, look, he says, you need to stop. You need to understand that you need to find the right answers. Give it a little thought. Let it sort of just go over in your mind. And then he talks about a bribe. A bribe to base is a bribe sounds out the heart. Well, how good's bribery? What does it accomplish? What good do you get out of it? The end is better than the beginning. How true? How true? The end is better than the beginning. It's always fun to be finished and to look back. You see, they sort of gave us a large timeline with Suzanne this week. Well, when we get finished with all this broken wrist stuff, it's going to be good. But we're not enjoying going through it. A man does not know how to dry a woman's hair. First time I did it with the blow dryer, how did we get done so fast? I don't know. I honestly don't. So the second time she had it figured out. See, she'd thought about it. Second time she said, that blow dryer's on high. I said, not today. Yes, it is. I turned it around, and I turned it off and turned it up. And oh, okay. Okay. Well, when it's all over with, we're going to learn some lessons from this. I better die first. No, that'll work its way out. But here's the point. Here's the point. We often understand once it's all over with, the going through it process is not fun. Think about growing up. Growing up wasn't fun, really, was it? But now we look back, we think of all the good times and all the memories we had. That's just really part of life. People talk about the good old days. And then I asked somebody, because I'd heard that, and I felt free enough with them. I asked them about the good old days. They said, man, the good old days. I said, did the chickens run under the house? They said they sure did. I said, could you see them through the cracks in the floor? They said, sure could. I said, was you cold in the winter? They said, we sure were. I said, was you hot in the summer? They said, we sure were. I said, did you work like a dog out in the fields during the day? Yes, we sure did. I said, did you stink because you didn't take a bath but once a week? We sure did. I said, that's good old days. They said, I better rethink that. I said, just wondered. And I just played it with them because I was very, very familiar with them. But we stop and think about it. The end of a thing, really, as far as waiting patiently, letting God work. But that's so hard, isn't it? It's so hard to wait on God. And we need to learn to wait on God. And he goes on to say, he said, patient spirit's better than the proud in spirit. Patient in spirit. That's one thing. My father was very patient. I'm thankful that he was. But very patient in spirit. Just could, okay, it'll be all right. We get it done. So he says, he comes to the conclusion with regards to taking your time. He says, do not hasten your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Don't be soon angry. Why? Because that's where anger rests. It rests in the bosom of fools. That's what they're considering. That's what they're all about, is they're constantly mad at something. And it's so sad in our society and just general mankind. And this has been true not just in the recent years. This has been true throughout years, is that there are those that they get mad at everything. Get mad at anything and everything. Doesn't matter what comes up. They just, I'm mad at, don't like it. Don't like it. And if it's raining, they don't like it. They want sunshine. If it's sunshining, they don't like it because it's not raining. There's just folks like that. And so Solomon says, let's think about this. He says, you don't have to be hasty in your spirit to be angry. Keep your composure. Why? Because anger rests in the bosom of fools. Better to take the long approach than the short approach. I read a long time ago about individuals president of a college. And a young boy came in, and this has been many, many, many years ago. And a young boy came in, and he said he wanted the quick route. And he said, I want the easy classes and the quick route. The president said, well, okay. He said, we can accommodate that, but he says, I can tell you this. He said, when you stop and think about a squash plant, he said, you go out in your garden in the springtime, you plant the plant. He says, the plant grows quickly. It grows to be very big. It grows and produces a lot of squash. He said, in a matter of 3 or 4 months, he said, squash is gone, plant's gone. There's never even any recognition or acknowledgement that the plant was ever there or the squash was ever produced. But he said, go out and plant an oak tree. And he said, go out and plant an oak tree. And he says, you're going to have to wait not just a few weeks, not just a few months, not just a few years. You're going to have to wait several years. But he said, the oak tree is going to eventually, especially if it gets nourishment, especially if it's taken care of, he says, that oak tree is going to survive. It's going to thrive. It's going to grow to be huge. It's going to leave lasting impression. It's going to serve a lot of people a lot of different ways. Now, do you want the hard way or do you want the easy way? And the boy thought, and he said, I think I'll take the oak tree way. I think we have a lesson to learn there. And I think, at least for me, when I read this, I see Solomon trying to dish out that kind of wisdom in these verses. Anything else? Verse 10. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Today's better than yesterday. We've already talked about that. Today is better than yesterday. Today may not be a good day in a lot of respects. Physically, you may hurt. Spiritually, you may be going through a great questioning period. From a standpoint of emotionally, it may be tough for whatever reason. And there are a lot of different reasons why that can be. And so we look at it and we say, okay, today's a tough day. Yeah, but notice what Solomon says. Think about what he says. He says, today's really better than yesterday. We've grown that much more. As the old saying goes, we've grown that much more wood. We know a little bit more. We have a little bit further insight. We've moved a little bit beyond. And so today really is better than yesterday. Folks live in the past, right? We tend to live in the past. Think about what you talked about this week. Did you talk about what you used to do, or did you talk about what you're going to do? Are you making plans for 2023? Let's make it more immediate. Are you making plans for Thanksgiving and Christmas? Are you? Well, let's think about today. Today is the blessing. Today is really all that you have. Yesterday's gone. Tomorrow is but a promise. Today is the only reality that you have. And so enjoy today. Enjoy today. Make it meaningful. Use every opportunity that you have. And I see that in this verse. Maybe you don't. I kind of do. I see the idea of let's just be concerned about today. Anything else that kind of I read one guy that said, let me just make this statement. He talked about, he says there are 3 positive contributions that wisdom makes that's found in these verses. And the first one is that it can make life better. And that's found in these first 10 verses. Now, in verses 11 through 18, he's going to talk about how wisdom helps us see life more clearly. But he says, first of all, wisdom, makes life better. Anything else? Well, look at what he says in verse 11. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and profitable to those who see the sun. For wisdom is a defense as money is a defense. But the excellence of knowledge is better than wisdom gives life to those who have it. Well, there's a lot said there, isn't there? When you think about it, he's talking about wealth, right? He says wisdom is good with an inheritance. If we just kind of look at that verse and kind of take it out of context, here's what it says. To be smart, that's how we kind of term wisdom. To be smart with money is a pretty good idea. Well, I'd rather be smart with money than to be dumb with money, wouldn't you? But that, we got to look a little deeper as far as what he's saying with regards to this. He talks about how that wisdom is good with an inheritance and profitable to those who see the sun, to those who look at it, to those who use it, to those who see what's going on in the world. Wisdom is a defense as money is a defense. Wisdom is protection, verse 12. He says it's a shadow, it's protection is the idea. Wisdom is a protection as money is protection. We need money, of course. How much money do you need? Well, we need enough to survive. And surviving depends upon the individual and the level upon which they live and upon the level upon which they can truly be godly, because godliness with contentment is great gain. Right? So, here's the point. He says wisdom is a defense as money is a defense. It's protection. Wisdom. We think about money. We think about the use of money. That sort of protects us. And like I said, we all want to live on a level, and we all want enough to have to get us through this world. And invariably, I saw this morning, nobody won the Powerball. It's in the billions of dollars. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to play it. It's gambling. I'm not going to play it. But at the same point in time, too, there are folks that's all they see. Will it help them get through life? I think I made mention of the fact I did not read the article, or I may have just talked about this to somebody, but I did not read the article, but I read the headline. Larry Bird used to play basketball, professional basketball for Boston Celtics. Really good basketball player in his day. He's from French Lick, Kentucky, which is, or Indiana, excuse me, which is it's a hole in the wall. It's a little bitty muddy spot. I've been through it. But nevertheless, Bird made a tremendous amount of money in his day, not in comparison to what is made today. But the title of the article was "Other Players Used to Laugh at Me when I Squirreled Away My Money. Now they're bankrupt." Use it wisely. Wisdom through life gets us through life. And he talks about the last part, the second part, if you will, of verse 12. Look at what he says. But the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. The excellence, the advantage, the profit of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. You got to have wisdom. You got to be wise with what you got. You got to be able to use what you know to be able to apply it. Is there anything along those lines? Absolutely. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I see that. I see this, like you say, at the end of his life, looking back. I think we all do that. When we realize that we have fewer days ahead of us than we do behind us, we have a lot more days behind us, maybe is the way I should say it. We have fewer days ahead of us and we have so many more days behind us. We do begin to realize what's really of value and importance. And to leave our children with, I'm thankful. My folks left me with nothing. It's not that I'm thankful that they did that, but I am thankful for the life that they did leave me with. The instruction as far as who is God and where is God and where does he fit in. And a lot of other things, a lot of practical things. How do you know that? Well, I just know it. Something probably mom and dad taught. And I found myself in the last couple of years, last year, really, something will happen. Suzanne and I are doing something, and I'll say, well, your father-in-law or your mother-in-law would say this. And so while they didn't leave me with any money, few bills, but they left me with a lot of good things. And I agree with Jim. I think that's what Solomon's doing here. We're going to talk about providence, verse 13. Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked. God's going to work it all out. Let God be God. We try to be God, right? Now, here's what we say. Well, I'm just helping him out. And yeah, the difficulty with God's providence is what? Trying to figure out what his part is and what my part is, right? Which decisions should I make? Which actions should I take? I've been praying. What should I do? Well, Solomon says, who can make straight what God's made crooked? Well, nobody. Think about God's providence. Think about how important it is and how important it is in our life. The work of God. Consider it. Think about it. Give thought to it. and think about that from a man that did what? Turned away from God. Right? In Exodus, wrong book, right Bible, wrong book. 1 Kings chapter 11. What I'm thinking about. 1 Kings chapter 11. And he had, talking about Solomon, he had 700 wives, princesses, 300 concubines. One little boy said in Bible class one time, he had 300 cucumber vines. And his wives turned away his heart. Now, here's my question. How wise was Solomon? And I'm not talking about the number of wives. I mean, God got it right for the rest of us when he said just marry one or one at a time. But they turned away his heart. They were idol worshipers. They were idolaters. And if you at it from the vantage point of an old man giving his children advice, he's saying, you better start thinking about God. And he goes on to say in verse 14, he talks about adversity and prosperity. He says, in the day of prosperity, be joyful. But in the day of adversity, consider. Well, we've already said that. When we hit rough times, what do we usually do? We think, right? Maybe it's because we slow down. I think, at least for me, that's part of it. We slow down. And we have that time and we're questioning, we're wondering. But surely, he says, God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him. He says, you got to understand that God has appointed both along the way. He says, so man can find out nothing that will come after him. He needs to have perspective in life. What's your perspective? How do you view life? It is interesting, something that really has nothing to do with these verses, but it's just a thought that I've been pondering. I don't know, I think I read it recently, and I've just been pondering it. And that's the idea that one of the arguments that's made that God doesn't exist is the problem, what's called the problem of evil, suffering. And if there was a God and he's loving, he's benevolent, he's kind, he would not allow us to suffer. And that is for the atheist, that is one of the best and biggest arguments that they have. But the best and biggest, truest answer is, why do we think suffering's bad? Where did our sense of what's right and what's wrong, good and evil, come from? It came from God. And so Solomon, I think, in many ways, sort of asked that question. He says, you need some perspective in life. You need to understand God is who he is. Adversity is all right. It'll give you time to consider. They both go hand in hand in our life. And then he says, talking about righteousness and sin, he says, I've seen everything in my days of vanity. Do you question that? Have you really seen everything? Now, he does tell us what's new under the sun, right? What does he say? He says, nothing's new. That's right. He says, nothing's new under the sun. But at the same time, too, when an individual says, well, I've seen everything, doubt that he's seen everything. He's probably seen symptoms of everything, maybe. But, folks, we do that, don't we? We use the word everything and all. I've done it all. Well, no, you haven't. But you've done a lot. He says, I've seen everything. And he says, there's a just man who perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who prolongs life in his wickedness. Now, that's, for a lot of folks, that's the million-dollar question, right? How do the just seem to die young and the unrighteous live a long time? How do the just seem to perish? Why do they seem to suffer? Why do they seem not to have? And yet, the wicked man, he just seems to go on and on and on and on. You've probably seen those things. You probably witnessed that. You've probably been with some. And if you are especially a younger man without wisdom, you begin to question that. And so he says in verse 16, he says, do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Doesn't that seem strange to be in the Bible? Don't be overly righteous. That's what God calls us to be. It's what God calls us to do. To be righteous, to be in right standing with him. And Solomon says, don't be overly righteous. Oh, Solomon, what in the world? Well, let him continue his thought. Then he says, verse 17, do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? It's good that you grasp this, and also not remove your hand from the other, for he who fears God will escape them all. Don't become so righteous that you're self-righteous. Have you seen people like that? Self-righteous people drive me nuts. If we understand who we are, where we are, what's going on in our life, where we fit in, we understand. Not only are we not there yet, but we don't have it made. When you see perfection, it's not in yourself. It may be in the creation of God, but it's not in you. Why? Because we mess up. People oftentimes, especially the millennials, talk about church people. And they're not talking about Church of Christ people. They're just talking about church people. Church people are so hypocritical in that they consider themselves so righteous. Well, I think probably church people are the ones that more often than not realize who they are, where they are, and realize that they're not as righteous as they need to be. Now, we may act self-righteous. We may condemn the other individual without proper understanding and knowledge, and compare them to us and say, I'm all right. But Solomon says, he's not talking about don't be overly righteous, don't be self-righteous. And he says, don't come out as a wicked person. Don't be foolish. He says, see yourself as you are. See yourself for who you are and as you are. Then he goes on to say, he says, it's good that you grasp this, and also do not remove your hand from others, for he who fears God will escape them all. He says, you need to see this. You need to understand this. The individual that fears God will escape them all. He'll come forth. The individual sees this. He's going to come forth shining. See yourself as an individual as you are. Now, how do we do that? How do we see ourselves as we are? Humility. We take a little bit of time, right, in our humility to look at ourselves. I shared, just a couple of weeks ago, I shared the story of a deacon that we were sitting in elders and deacons meeting, and the elders said something about the contribution, and this deacon who was treasurer spoke up, and he says, and he had a very good job. His wife had a very good job, probably some of the better paying jobs within the congregation. And he said, I give in accordance to what everybody else gives. That's not what the verse says. The verse says you give as you've prospered, not as other people have prospered. Plus the fact, how much do you know that I have or don't have? I let the elders answer him, and wasn't really happy with their answer. But I thought, I've often used that illustration to think about, there's a man that wasn't looking at what he himself had, but what do we do about where we are? Not just financially what we have, contribution, and judge ourselves and measure ourselves that way. But what about, do we look at ourselves where we are with regards to spiritually? Where's our heart? Where's our service to God? Where is it? Is it where it should be? Is it where it's supposed to be? And he concludes this thought by saying, he who fears God will escape them all. He'll come forth out of it. But it's the individual that what? Fears God. Fears God. Something, I know I've missed some stuff in there, but something I've covered several verses, something somebody wants to add. Well, he moves thoughts now. He talks about wisdom. We've been talking about wisdom. It really helps us see life clearly. But now he's going to talk about wisdom helps us face life stronger. It's interesting. Here's a man that we consider him to be the wisest man on all the earth. Why? Because God gave him wisdom. And we consider that wisdom to have gotten him through life. He amassed a great deal of fortune. He amassed a great deal of wealth. He's still searching for happiness. And here all of a sudden, while he, in the very first chapter of this book that he's written by inspiration, claims wisdom's useless. Now all of a sudden he comes back full circle and says, you need wisdom. But here's the caveat, if you think about it. He's gone through and he's talked about in the first 6 chapters, he's talked about looking for happiness and understanding in everything else in life. And it turned out was meaningless. And now he says, okay, wisdom's not so bad. But that wisdom, notice the very first part of this next section, verse 19. Wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 rulers of the city. He says, you need wisdom. Now, let me, because the bell's fixing to ring, and we'll just stop right here. But let me give you food for thought. Just connect the dots in this book. To connect the dots in the book, he concludes the book by saying to do what? Fear who? God. And keep his commandments, for this is man's all. The old King James says, for this is the duty of man. This is man's all. Fear God. You see, he comes around and he makes full circle. He says, okay, you got to put into use, just as we defined it, as you all so beautifully defined it by your suggestions and answering the questions. Here's wisdom. Now put it to use, but put it to use for God. Put it to use for God and not for yourself. Interesting thought, isn't it? Well, I hope you'll think about that. Anything else we need to say? We'll start there. We'll kind of come back to verse 19 for just a second, but we'll look at that next week. Well, let's bow for a word of prayer right quick. Thank you, God, for Father in heaven. Thank you for this day. Thank you for all that you've given to us, for the beautiful sunshine, for the rain we had yesterday. We're thankful that you love us, that you watch over us. We ask those with love that will not be mentioned in our announcements that are needing help. We ask that you bless them, keep them, and hold them in a very special way. We ask that you be with us as we go throughout the rest of this worship service, that we'll worship you in spirit and in truth. Watch over us, bless us, and keep us, and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name, amen. Y'all have a fantastic week. Thank y'all so much for your participation.